Good afternoon, everyone. It is 2:30 on the dot, so we're going to get started. Welcome to the February webinar for the National Weather Service Spring Hydrologic Outlook. This is Katie Artell from the National Weather Service's National Water Center. Today's briefing will be a general overview of the Spring Hydrologic Outlook for the Mississippi Basin, including the Red River of the North and the Great Lakes drainages. Additional information and forecasts can be found online at www.weather.gov. Today's presenters are Jim Knoll from the Ohio River Forecast Center, Andrew Mangum from North Central River Forecast Center, Kevin Lau from Missouri Basin River Forecast Center, James Paul from Arkansas Red Basin River Forecast Center, and Jeff Grashel from the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center. This webinar is being recorded, and a follow-up email will be sent with information on how to access that recording. Should you have any questions during the presentation, please go ahead and type that into the question box on the GoToWebinar GUI here, and we will address it at the conclusion of the presentation. Let's begin with our first presenter, Jim Knoll.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. This is Jim Knoll again at the Ohio River Forecast Center. We're going to begin by taking a look at the current conditions across the Mississippi drainage system, as well as the Great Lakes and Red River of the North areas. The first slide that you're looking at is the winter precipitation so far across the central U.S. And what you'll see is a lot of green, and that is representative of the fact that we have above normal precipitation across the majority of the Mississippi drainage system into the Great Lakes. I wanted to highlight a couple areas in the blues where we are seeing very wet conditions since December 1st. This map is since December 1st. And those blue areas are from very far eastern Dakotas, northern Minnesota into northern Wisconsin and upper Michigan, where precipitation is 175 to over 200% of normal, mostly in the form of snow. And then we have another area that's really developed in the last couple of weeks, from the lower Ohio Valley to the Cumberland and Tennessee valleys down into a portion of the lower Mississippi Valley in the state of Mississippi. And those blues are showing, again, areas 175 to well over 200% of normal precipitation. The image to the right is last year during 2019 winter. And the big difference is, even though precipitation this winter is above normal over the majority of the basin, except portions of the headwaters of the upper Missouri Basin, it's not quite as intense overall from the aerial coverage and extent, but we still have pockets of very wet conditions. So the bottom line message here is it's still wet going into this flood season. Moving along to our next slide of temperatures, we do see a significant difference between last winter and this winter. This winter in the middle image there in the middle of the page is showing pretty much, you're seeing the oranges. It's above normal temperatures across the entire Mississippi drainage system into the Great Lakes, with the core of the warmth extending from the Great Lakes down through the Ohio Valley into the Tennessee Cumberland Valley, where temperatures in the eastern portion of the Mississippi system into the Great Lakes have been running 5 or 6 degrees above normal. But really for the entire basin, we're at 1 to 6 degrees above normal. This is a lot warmer than last winter, where we had those greens in that right image in the upper Midwest, northern plains, northern Rockies, where we had below normal temperatures. So this winter, these milder conditions, one thing they are doing is reducing ice formation overall in our rivers. Moving along to the next slide, we're going to take a look at snowfall so far this winter as a percent of normal. This is the amount of snow that's fallen, not how much water content's on the ground. We're going to get to that in just a minute. What you're seeing is the one difference between last winter and this winter is across the Mississippi system here as a whole, we do have above normal snowfall, but it's much more contained into a smaller area than last winter, where it was very widespread through the Missouri and upper Mississippi system. This winter so far, the above normal snowfall in those blues in the far eastern Dakotas through northern Minnesota, and the greens across northern Wisconsin into upper Michigan we do have that above normal snowfall that's fallen, but it's in a smaller area. Elsewhere, because of the warm temperatures, a lot of our precipitation has fallen as either a mixed precipitation or in the form of rain further to the south, and that's why you see a lot more of the oranges and reds from the Ohio Valley into the mid-Mississippi Valley and portions of the lower Missouri Basin, much more normal to below normal snowfall. So the above normal snowfall so far this winter has really been contained in those northern areas. By moving on to the next slide, you're going to actually see as we look at how much water is in that snowpack that's on the ground, what you'll see is it's very similar conditions in terms of water content and in terms of inches of water that is in that snowpack that we have to be concerned about for spring runoff. But the snow water content over the eastern Dakotas is similar to or a little bit less than last winter, and Kevin at the Missouri Basin will be talking a little bit more about that. But we do have as much or a little bit more extending from Minnesota across northern Wisconsin into the northern Great Lakes area. Elsewhere, there's just not a lot of water content. That gray area that you see from Ohio, lower Michigan, into Indiana, Illinois, parts of Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, that's very shallow, very light amounts of water equivalent, well under an inch in most areas. So again, the snow water content in our snowpack can find further north because of those warmer temperatures where the snow has been falling this winter. Moving on to the next slide of soil moisture, because of the very wet year last year where some of the states in the upper Midwest into the Great Lakes had their wettest year on record dating back into the late 1800s, and the states that did not were usually most of our states in the Mississippi system, and at least in the northern areas, were in the top 5, if not 1, 2, or 3. And therefore, that soil moisture you see is in the top 1 percentile, or basically it's near the wettest, if not the wettest on record in terms of our soil water content in the ground, in the upper reaches of the soils from Michigan through Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, into eastern Montana. But really, even further south, you see all that green from the Ohio Valley into the lower Mississippi Valley, mid-Mississippi Valley. So it's wet. It's wetter than last year. We're classifying it as the soils are saturated or nearly saturated. And because the ground is frozen in the upper Midwest, Great Lakes, into the northern plains, that water is locked into the ground. And so as we warm up into the spring, get rainfall events onto that melting snow, and then when the snow is gone, you will have potential for excessive runoff. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to take a look at the drought monitor just briefly. And because of the wet soil conditions across the Mississippi drainage system as a whole, we just don't have very much drought. Really, the only drought that's of any significance that is ongoing is in the headwaters of like the Arkansas Basin and portions of southeastern Colorado into southwest Kansas and the panhandle of Oklahoma in that area there. So there's just not much drought going on, and we don't really foresee much really expansion into drought conditions as we go into spring in the Mississippi system. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to look at the U.S. Geological 7-day stream flows. And because of the wet conditions in the ground and because of the rainfall events that have been ongoing over the last, say, 6 weeks with an active weather pattern, you'll see a lot of blue, light blue, dark blue, and black. Black means you're right up at the wettest on record for a 7-day flow for this time of the year. You'll see some of that down in Tennessee and Mississippi, some blacks in Iowa and southern Minnesota. But the bottom line is you don't see a lot of green even, and that means that stream flows are running above normal. What the water that's moving through the system is above normal for this time of the year, which is not surprising. The white areas across the upper Midwest and northern plains, that is where basically we have iced over conditions going on, and so you don't see any reporting of stream flows conditions there. But where they start breaking up, you'll see blues and blacks appear as we go through the next, say, 4 to 8 weeks. One thing that should be noted is that ice conditions are considered near normal in most areas, a little bit above, a little bit below, but significantly less than last year when we had that really cold condition in the upper Midwest. And the Ohio Valley has no ice and is considered below normal for this time of the year. Moving on to the Army Corps of Engineer information now. This is the next slide that will show flood storage used. And the main message here is that the Army Corps of Engineers manages the water through our Mississippi system. That is their function to do once the water is on the ground. And the bottom line is they've done a really good job of getting rid of the excess of water from 2019. And so this graphic shows the different river systems from the Ohio into the Missouri, upper Mississippi systems, down into the Arkansas and Red systems. And what you see is most of those numbers are less than 10% used. So that means that there's over 90% capacity in their flood control projects that can be used for future heavy rainfall events. So overall, we're sitting in pretty good condition right now in our system. Moving along to the next slide, this has been an ongoing issue in the Great Lakes, and so we did want to highlight this. This is a coordinated effort. This information comes from the Army Corps of Engineers, Detroit District. They do the actual forecasts for the Great Lakes, so we did want to highlight what is going on just briefly on the Great Lakes. For Lake Superior, they are forecasting to be within a couple inches of record levels through July. For Lake Michigan and Huron, they are forecasting above last year's levels and at record high levels in every one of the next 6 months. Moving over to Lake St. Clair, they're also forecasting record levels through June and then within an inch or so by July. And then for Lake Erie, they have increased the forecast now to near record or record levels through May, and then within a few inches of the record by the time we get to June and July. And finally, Lake Ontario is forecast to be way above normal but below the record levels. That is important only because as we get storms to move through the system into spring, that'll cause erosion and some lakeshore flooding that has already occurred, and we do expect more of it into the spring. Now we're going to switch gears and move on to the precipitation forecasts and the weather and climate outlooks that'll influence our hydrologic river outlooks into the spring. This next slide is showing the precipitation forecast over the next week. And we do still see fairly active patterns suppressed to the south from the lower Mississippi Valley into the Tennessee, Cumberland, and Ohio Valley, where we're expecting an additional 1 to 2 inches of liquid, mostly in the form of rain, a little bit of snow further north. Further to the north through the Great Lakes and into the upper Midwest and Missouri Basin, light amounts, generally under a half inch, are forecast as the storm track will be suppressed to the south. The storms that are expected over the next week are not as significant as the storms that we've seen in recent weeks, though. Moving along to our week 2 outlook that goes through February 26th, the Climate Prediction Center of NOAA is forecasting above normal temperatures in about the northern half of the Mississippi drainage system into the Great Lakes and normal temperatures further to the south. At the same time, that storm track will be suppressed down in the lower Mississippi Valley on into the lower Ohio Valley, where you see the green shaded, that is above normal precipitation expected on that week 2 outlook. At the same time, the pattern should be fairly quiet. That's some short-term good news from portions of the Great Lakes through the Missouri Basin and into the upper Mississippi Valley. The exception would be the upper reaches of the Missouri Basin, those green areas in Montana. There is some above normal precipitation forecast there. And as we move along then further into spring on the next slide with our Climate Prediction Center outlook for temperatures and precipitation, we are expecting above normal temperatures in the southern portion of the system, and then what we call equal chances, where it's not really certain, the confidence is low, whether we'll see above, below, or normal temperatures. But the one thing that they are forecasting is above normal precipitation into the spring across a good portion of the Mississippi drainage system as well as the Great Lakes. The primary focus area would be the Ohio Valley, Great Lakes, upper Mississippi Valley, and even a portion of the upper Missouri Basin is forecast to be above normal precipitation. Combine that with all of the current conditions that are wet, that does raise the concern level for flooding as we go into spring. Now we're going to switch gears and see how all of that weather and climate forecasts impact our actual river outlooks for flood risk. We are expecting another year of widespread flooding into spring across the Mississippi Basin as a whole. The above normal flood potential is really focused in the eastern 2/3 of the Mississippi drainage system. The most significant flooding right now is expected in the upper Missouri, Red River of the North, and portions of the upper Mississippi Valley. But it should be highlighted that about 30% of all forecast locations that the National Weather Service does in the Mississippi drainage system into the Great Lakes are forecast to be above flood levels at least once this spring. So we are expecting a fairly widespread nature to the flooding. There will be different magnitudes of intensity to that flooding. As you can see, just because you're outside of those purple areas that I've circled, like the upper Mississippi River or portions of the upper Missouri or the Red River to the north, there are still a lot of scattered reds, meaning moderate floods, and purples, meaning major floods in other areas of the basin. So there is a fairly widespread flood risk in the Mississippi system as a whole, as well as in portions of the Great Lakes as we go through this spring. So with that, we're now going to break it down by each one of our river forecast center basins and go into a little bit more detail. We will begin in the Ohio and Cumberland basins, where we are forecasting a greater than 50% chance of minor and moderate floods this spring. The primary threat appears to be south of the Ohio River and west of the state of Ohio. So our southern and western portion of the basin is at most risk for flooding this spring. Moving along to the next slide, but I want to show you that even though we are looking at the greater than 50% chance of flooding, we also want to look at the possibility of flooding at the 25% or greater chance, because in the Ohio River Basin, unlike other basins, snowfall is not the big driver. It's actually rainfall and thunderstorms. So just below that threat level at 25% or greater, or the possibility of significant flooding really does exist. You see a lot of reds and purples across the southern and western portion of the Ohio Valley down into the Cumberland Basin. So there is a real threat for some significant flooding in the Ohio Valley as well as the Cumberland Valley as we go through springtime. Now I'm going to break it down a little bit more by state areas and get into a little bit more detail within the Ohio Valley. So for eastern Illinois and the state of Indiana, we are expecting minor flooding with at least a 50% chance of occurrence in the Maumee, the Wabash, the White, and the East Fork of the White Basins. In addition to that, we are expecting at least a 50% chance of moderate flooding in portions of the lower ends of the White, Wabash, and Little Wabash Basin in southeastern Illinois. Moving further to the south on the next slide, in the states of Kentucky and Tennessee, we are expecting a fairly widespread nature to minor flooding for the Licking, Little Sandy, Kentucky, and upper Cumberland basins. We've already had flooding in some of these basins from recent rains, and we expect additional flooding as we go through the next 2 to 3 months. In addition, we're also expecting moderate flooding in the upper Kentucky as well as portions of the Green River Basin as we go through the spring. Shifting gears on the next slide to the states of Ohio and West Virginia, we are expecting minor flooding for the Maumee and Muskingum Basins in Ohio, as well as the Monongahela Basin in West Virginia. In addition to that, it is important to note, because of the high water levels that the Army Corps of Engineers is forecasting on Lake Erie, we do expect the elevated risk for erosion and high water impacts to continue along the Lake Erie shoreline of Ohio. It'll be storm dependent as well, but we do expect impacts there along the Lake Erie shoreline into spring with some flood impacts. And finally, in terms of the breakdown for the Ohio Basin on the next slide is the Ohio River itself. We currently have an event unfolding, and we expect additional events through spring. And right now we're thinking at least a 50% or greater chance of flooding, minor flooding, below Racine Lock and Dam on the Ohio River, with at least a 25% chance on the lower Ohio of reaching moderate flood levels as we go through the next few months. And on the last slide for me, for the summary for the flood potential for the Ohio and Cumberland River Basin, we are expecting a fairly widespread minor to moderate flood event this spring, especially in southern and western areas of the Ohio Basin down into the Cumberland River Basin. We also do expect some isolated major flooding in the lower half of the Ohio Valley. Flood risk is considered above normal for about the lower half to 2/3 of the Ohio Valley, up to twice the normal risk for Indiana, Eastern Illinois, Kentucky, and Tennessee, while flood risk in Ohio, West Virginia, Western Pennsylvania, and Southwest New York is near normal. Normal for us would be some minor flooding is possible. Lake Erie's shoreline flooding is elevated with the risk for additional erosion and high water impacts with those record to near record levels on Lake Erie. And finally, rainfall and thunderstorms will determine the final outcome for the flood risk in the Ohio and Cumberland basins as we go through March and April. And with that, I'm going to turn it over now to Andrew at the North Central River Forecast Center.
Thank you, Jim, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrew Mangum with the North Central River Forecast Center. I'm going to start off by talking about the conditions that we have in the RFC and then move into the flood risk. Now, we'll start off with talking about snow water content, and Jim already went through this in good detail. So I really want to focus on the hydrologic impacts of our snow water content distribution. Generally, we have 1 to 4 inches of snow water content spread up through the northern part of our basins. But we've got really heavy accumulations right around the shores of Lake Superior in the 8 to 12 inch range up there. So that's primed to feed in more water into Lake Superior. We also have some heavier accumulations in the upper portion of the Mississippi River drainage basin and the southern reaches of the Red River of the North Basin. So there's plenty of snow water content on the ground ready to feed into our major river systems. Thankfully, we have some areas without very much snow water content. That once you get south of the Wisconsin-Illinois border and southern Michigan, and also way out in western North Dakota in the Souris River Basin. If we move on to the next slide, we'll talk about the snow water content rankings in all of the basins through our areas. These are really reflective of our precipitation patterns. Generally, a lot of it is elevated, and through Iowa and southern Wisconsin, we're in the 60 to 70% rankings. Up in Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, the UP, and eastern North Dakota, we're in the 80s and 90s. So very, very wet conditions. Rankings are closer to normal for Michigan and Illinois, and actually below normal out in the Souris River Basin in western North Dakota. On our next slide, we'll talk about the frost depths in the region. If you remember from last year, we had a pretty deep freeze, and it drove some very, very strong frost depths that played a big part in some of our runoff scenarios. This year, we have more typical frost depths, generally 12 to 24 inches near the Mississippi River Basin, and dropping off really sharply once you get down into Illinois and Iowa and Missouri. It should be noted that while this is typical and normal, our significant frost depths are also where a lot of our snow water content is, and so frost depth will still be a player when it comes to runoff during the spring melt. Okay, and for our next slide for conditions, our final slide for conditions, we'll talk about the ice jam threat. Cold snaps earlier and a cold early part of the winter did drive some rapid ice production, and we had some river stage elevation. But then those milder months of December and January actually allowed, not only did it slow ice production, but it actually allowed the ice to break up a bit and get flushed down the Mississippi River. And since then, conditions have stayed mild, so we're having fairly slow ice development. And with all of that combined, we're comfortable saying that the threat of breakup ice jamming moving into the spring is low to medium. And that's enough about our conditions. Let's move on now to the actual hydrologic outlook, the flood outlook. Starting with an overview of the whole NCRFC. Generally, the flood outlook is significantly elevated risk of flooding, 1.5 to 2 times the normal risk for flooding. Our primary areas of concern where we're going to see the biggest impacts are going to be in the Red River of the North Basin and the upper Mississippi. There are also going to be widespread impacts, and we're going to discuss all that as we break this down state by state. And so we're going to move into that discussion next, starting off with North Dakota, where our primary concern is the Red River of the North. We've got a 50% or greater chance of moderate to major flooding up and down the entire river. Out west in the Souris Basin, there's an elevated risk of moderate flooding. The difference in the kind of impacts there really has to do with snow water content on the ground. Now, remember that the Souris was out in a very dry region. Moving on then to Minnesota and South Dakota. Any impacts felt by the Red River of the North are also going to be felt by Minnesota. But Minnesota will also have to contend with a greater than 50% chance of major flooding along the length of the Mississippi River. The Minnesota River itself is a bit of a mixed bag. It's got points at minor, but it also has points at major and moderate. And a lot of that has to do with variations of snow water content on the ground. Moving on now, we'll talk about Wisconsin. The state of Wisconsin is going to be feeling any impacts from flooding on the Wisconsin River along the Mississippi River along its border. In the interior of the state, we're expecting widespread minor flooding along the length of the Wisconsin River and also along the length of the Menominee River and the border with Michigan, and then scattered points of moderate and minor flooding. However, there are a couple of areas of particular concern related to lake levels that we wanted to call out with this slide. Lake levels, as Jim said, in Lake Michigan are at record high levels. We're talking historically high lake levels, and we were seeing significant impacts of flooding just from storm surge from wind blowing the water up into, especially around the areas around Green Bay. And so we're talking about a pretty elevated risk of minor to moderate flood impacts on the shores of Lake Michigan due to kind of backwater effects really from the water going into the lake and storm surge impacts. And this is especially true for the East and the Fox and the Oconto rivers, but it really cannot be understated that there is going to be some elevated risk and elevated vulnerability on any rivers that are flowing into the shores of Lake Michigan. And that includes everything down on the southern reaches of the Wisconsin shoreline. Moving south now into Iowa and Illinois and Missouri, the big story in this part of the NCRFC is going to be the Mississippi River. We have a greater than 50% chance of major flooding all the way down to Lock and Dam 19, and we've got a 50% chance or greater of moderate flooding from Lock and Dam 19 to St. Louis. Outside of the main stem itself, we're really talking about a widespread elevated risk of minor flooding throughout the tributaries in the Illinois River system. We're also, again, because we're talking about the Great Lakes, around Chicago, there's some elevated risk from on lakeshore flooding effects there as well. And any rivers such as the Calumet that flow into the lakes are going to be at an elevated risk. Moving now finally into Michigan and in northern Indiana. Because of the lower snow water content in Michigan, we're talking more about kind of widespread minor to moderate flooding in this area. Well, really only one point that we're concerned about on the Huron River for moderate flooding, but we do have good chances for minor flooding along the Muskegon, Grand, St. Joseph, Kankakee, and Rifle rivers and the Menominee. However, just like all the other states bordering Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, all of the points there, all the mouths of the river there right on the lakeshore are very vulnerable to lake effect flooding, essentially. And so that needs to be taken into account. So finally, moving on to our summary slide, there is a significantly elevated risk of moderate to major flooding in the NCRFC this year. And that's driven largely by extremely wet soil conditions, saturated soils, and high snow water content in key drainage areas for the Mississippi and the Red River of the North. And along with that, there is also complications this year that we're expecting from historic lake levels. So with that, I'll turn things over to Kevin Lau at NBRFC.
Thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon, everyone. Flood risk, to continue the saga of good news, flood risk for this spring is well above normal for the eastern portion of the Missouri River Basin. 2019 was the third wettest year on record, going back 125 years for the Missouri Basin, and that has led to a high risk for flooding, especially in the east. The right-hand graphic is the 90-day stage distribution for the Missouri River at St. Joseph, Missouri. And I put it up here to serve as an example of the departure or gap between historic conditions and today's conditions. And historic is the blue line, and today's condition is the black line. And so what this right-hand graph shows is that conditions on the ground today result in an increase in the chance to reach flood stage at St. Joseph of 37% over what normally the likelihood for reaching minor flood stage would be. Historically, St. Joe has roughly a 51% chance of hitting flood stage, and this spring it'll have a 88% chance of reaching flood stage, a 40% jump. And on the map on the left, St. Joseph would show up as an orange color or an orange dot. The colors depicting the departure from historic for each forecast location in the Missouri Basin. So what this map shows is that locations across the eastern portion of the Missouri Basin have anywhere from a 10 to as much as a 70% jump in likelihood to see flooding. Moving now to look at the mountains, this graphic is courtesy of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and it shows the mountainous basin snowpack in percent of average snow water equivalent, the amount of liquid that's stored in the mountain snowpack. Mountain snowpack can be categorized as slightly above average in the mountainous west. By this point in the winter, we usually have accumulated about 70% of the seasonal peak snow water equivalent. So we've still got a little ways to go, and things could change. With the next slide, the February water supply forecast issued early this month by our office is graphically shown here, and it suggests a near average mountain runoff year, volumetrically speaking, for the mountainous west. Significant flooding from mountain snowmelt alone is not expected this year. Moving then to the plains, as Andrew and Jim have already talked about, there is an appreciable plain snowpack in the eastern Dakotas with widespread 2 to 3 inch water equivalent amounts and some 4+ inch amounts in South Dakota, and this is concerning. I now will go state by state through the Missouri watershed, highlighting those basins where our long-range outlooks indicate a better than 50% chance of seeing flooding, and I'll primarily focus on moderate and major levels. As of right now, moderate flooding is likely along the James River in North Dakota, shown here in red. Moving to South Dakota, major flooding is expected along the James, the Vermilion, and the Big Sioux Rivers. Today marks the 336th consecutive day of flooding for the James River in South Dakota. Moving southward into Nebraska, moderate level flooding is likely along Wahoo Creek, and I will also point out that the Platte River in Nebraska is also likely to see minor flooding. Moving across the river into Iowa, both the Big Sioux and the upper end of the Little Sioux basins are projected to see major flooding this year. Moving to Kansas, we are expecting moderate level flooding along Stranger Creek and on the Little Osage River as it enters Missouri. And then moving to our last state, the state of Missouri, we are expecting flooding on many creeks, moderate level along several of those creeks, including the Grand and the Platte River in Missouri. And lastly, I broke out the lower 800 miles of the Missouri River for its own slide. Flooding along the main stem is projected from Blair, Nebraska to the mouth at St. Louis this year. Now with this graphic, I'm going a bit further out than just 90 days, and I'm picking up more of the potential convective summertime activity. And so this graphic hopefully depicts what is a worst case scenario. And with that said, I do expect minor flooding possible in the Omaha and Kansas City reaches and moderate flooding elsewhere. As we move into the summer, major level flooding cannot be ruled out below Kansas City. It can't be ruled out. Many of the levees along the Missouri River downstream of Gavin's Point Dam have yet to be fully restored after the 2019 flood. And although the National Weather Service is in continual communication with other federal agencies with regard to current stage flow relationships, river stage outlooks, and short-term stage forecasts, will have a high degree of uncertainty due to the current state of the channel and overbank areas. And so in summary then, I'll move to my summary slide. Snowpack in the mountains is slightly above average for this time of year. There does exist an appreciable plain snowpack in the eastern Dakotas and that will play a significant role in flood potential this spring. A relatively mild winter has prevented a deep frozen ground condition over most of the basin. Breakup ice jam potential is less than it was a month or so ago, but folks still need to be watchful, especially in the Dakotas. It really depends on the rate of river ice thaw and the timing of rain events. Thunderstorm activity typically drives spring flooding in the lower third of the basin. A much above normal flood risk exists across the entire eastern part of the Missouri Basin. Major flooding is likely along the northern tributaries and widespread moderate elsewhere. Thank you, and this concludes the flood potential brief for the Missouri Basin. I'll now turn the presentation over to James Paul in the Arkansas Red Basin. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to briefly go over the Arkansas Red Basin's current conditions, starting with some precipitation information. The plot on the left shows how the snow water equivalent in the upper part of the Arkansas River stands. As of a couple days ago, it was roughly 120% of normal. While we don't expect an increase in flood risk in this area from the snowmelt, it does bode well for water supply out west. In the graphic on the right, we're looking at the last 60 days percent of normal precipitation. Much of the eastern two-thirds of the basin has received above normal precipitation, and this lines up pretty well with the soil moisture graphic that Jim Knoll showed earlier in the presentation for the area. It also shows the area of drought in southeast Colorado and northeast New Mexico. On the next slide, we're going to show some information from our partners at the USGS and the Corps of Engineers. The left image uses data from the USGS, shows that much of the eastern half of the basin has experienced above average stream flows over the past 2 weeks. The image on the right shows the used and available space in the core reservoirs. This is only showing the reservoirs that have at least 5% of their flood storage filled. The reservoirs still do have most of their flood storage available, but it is interesting to note that at this time last year, there were not as many reservoirs above the 10% flood pool usage. This is another part of the reason for the higher than average flows seen on the USGS map as the Corps continues to release the water to try to draw down the lake levels before the spring rains hit. Our next slide shows our long-term forecast. It indicates scattered locations with a greater than 50% chance of flooding. Although we aren't seeing any widespread areas of above 50% chance of flooding, we do have a few rivers which we are more concerned about. These include the Neosho in southeast Kansas and northeast Oklahoma, the Illinois and Poto rivers in eastern Oklahoma, and Clear Boggy Creek in southeast Oklahoma. And finally, on my summary slide, we do have some rivers where we expect to see spring flooding, and in general, we are calling for an above normal potential across the eastern half of the basin. This, however, does not include the main stem of the Red River downstream of Lake Texoma, nor the main stem of the Arkansas River in central Arkansas, where we are expecting a near normal flood potential. We're also calling for a near normal flood potential in the western half of the basin. And as a reminder, most of the spring flooding that does occur within the Arkansas Red Basin is driven by convective storms, which can occur over any portion of our watershed. And with that, I'll pass it on to Jeff Groschel at the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center.
Alrighty, thank you, James. I guess the big message that we have right now is we have pretty significant flooding that is occurring right now in the central parts of Mississippi, and also minor to moderate flooding with the crest that we're looking at on the Mississippi River from Cairo southward down through New Orleans, with the heavier rainfall that we've had over the last almost 2 months or so. We've had in excess of 15 to 25 inches of rainfall that's occurred over parts of Mississippi and the Tennessee Valley. So things have been extremely wet, as Jim had already alluded to with the soil moisture conditions earlier in the slide presentation. Switching to the next slide and talking about Illinois, Kentucky, Arkansas, and Missouri, you can see that we've highlighted the Mississippi River itself. Obviously, we've got minor to moderate flooding occurring right now, and we expect that to continue here over the next several months as things are really primed and
and really be dependent on the magnitude of the flooding that we see in the future will be really dependent on how much rainfall and melt that we get upstream over the next couple of months. The other areas that we need to talk about a little bit is also in the Black and White River systems in the eastern part of Arkansas. We are expecting minor flooding in those locations, but there is going to be some places that could get moderate flooding with any additional rainfall that we get over the next couple of months. Likewise, over the Ouachita, we right now actually are experiencing minor flooding at this time in those locations as well, and we could get some isolated moderate flooding in those locations too. Moving to the next slide and talking about Tennessee and Alabama, those areas have been very wet. Soil moisture conditions are very high. A lot of the tributaries and stuff going into the Tennessee River, we've already experienced minor to moderate, and a couple of locations have already had major flooding already this year. That should continue if we do get additional heavy rainfall over the next several weeks or months. Isolated points have an elevated risk for major floodings, especially in the northern parts of Alabama. And then, as we had mentioned already, on the Mississippi River itself, minor to moderate flooding will continue. On the next slide, we'll switch over to the Louisiana and Mississippi area. Those areas right now are experiencing some of our biggest impacts as far as flooding is concerned, particularly in the Big Black and the Pearl River basins. We already have major flooding on the Big Black, and levels there are only half a foot to a foot away from getting record levels for those locations. So the same is true for the Pearl River. The Pearl River and Mississippi is also has a major flooding that's already expected here over the next several days. Evacuations and stuff are already being prepared for both of those river locations. So those two locations obviously have a very elevated risk for major flooding over the coming weeks and months. Again, over the Mississippi River and the Atchafalaya rivers, we are expecting minor to moderate flooding that will happen. We're not going to get any cresting conditions down in the New Orleans area until the first part of March. And then any additional rainfall that we get later on in the season and stuff certainly could give us a risk for more minor to moderate flooding for those locations. The rest of the area, though, has been a little bit drier, especially as you get into the western parts of Louisiana. So we're only anticipating some minor flooding in those locations, which is very typical for the winter and springtime. And then finally, on my summary slide, okay, little delay here on our end here. Minor to moderate flooding is expected this spring over the lower Mississippi, tributaries going into the Tennessee, Yazoo and Pearl rivers. But we're really, specifically in the Big Black and Pearl rivers, we really have a expectation for major flooding for those locations. Also, too, in the Tennessee Valley, the tributaries going into the Tennessee River, particularly in northern parts of Alabama, with already elevated levels on those particular rivers and continuing to have minor and moderate flooding at this time, those areas could have potential major flooding again later on in the coming weeks and months. Finally, the flood risk is above normal, too, for the eastern portions of the lower Mississippi Valley. But as you go further west into the lower Mississippi Valley, we start to get more of a normal flood risk for those locations. And just as James, and because of being in the south, we really don't have snowfall. Rainfall and thunderstorms really determine the final outcome and the magnitude of the flooding that we get in a lot of these locations. And with that, I will turn it back over to Jim at OHRC.
All right, thanks, Jeff. And we're going to go ahead and summarize this all up in this slide here. It should be stressed we already have significant flooding ongoing in portions of the Ohio, Cumberland, Tennessee Valley to the lower Mississippi Valley. So this does appear to be a long, prolonged, kind of stretched out flood season yet again this year in the Mississippi drainage system as a whole. We do expect widespread flooding as we go into spring in the months of March, April, and even May. In the Mississippi River system. The flood risk is considered above to much above normal for the eastern two-thirds of the Mississippi River system. That includes the Red River of the North and the Great Lakes. And I want to stress that even outside of these highlighted areas, anywhere in that eastern two-thirds of the Mississippi system, since we do have an active weather pattern, significant floods can occur even where we indicate minor to moderate floods. So we do have to monitor a good portion of the Mississippi River system. There is a normal risk for flooding And that is contained in those western areas of the Missouri Basin, western portions of the Arkansas and Red, even a little bit of the western portion, as Jeff said, of the lower Mississippi Basin, and then also the upper Ohio Basin. The greatest chances for major flooding appear to be in the Red River of the North and parts of the upper Mississippi and upper Missouri basins. But again, anywhere in the eastern two-thirds of the Mississippi River system, we do have to monitor that flood risk. Therefore, we will have the next partners briefing on Thursday, February 27th. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Katie at the National Water Center for your questions.
All right, thank you so much to all of the presenters today. We are now going to enter into a question and answer session. Just a reminder, if you do have a question, could you please go ahead and type it into the question box in the GoToWebinar, and that is how we will address the questions moving forward. We do have 2 questions in already. Jim, actually the first question is for you in the Ohio Basin. How does the graphic displaying the upper Cumberland Basin show orange, given that we just experienced major flooding?
Yeah, so our graphics are from day 6 to day 96 is how we operate. And so we try not to account for the exact current condition today. And so therefore, we're really trying to look at those graphics that we're showing you at the flood risk going forward out in the future relative to what's going on just in the next couple of days, because otherwise we can skew, you won't really know what the flood risk is for like March and April. And so that's why you see it that way.
All right, thank you, Jim. Our second question is for Kevin at Missouri Basin River Forecast Center. Does anything about the distribution of snow in the Dakotas, the high snow water equivalent in East Dakotas and the low snow water equivalent in the Western Dakotas, suggest anything about the duration of the flooding this year?
Well, yeah, that's a good question, I guess. My primary concern is the fact that this snow will result in major flooding. Well, the plain snow coupled with the fact that we're saturated will result in major flooding along the James and along the Big Sioux. And so I expect that typically it's late March, April when that flooding will happen. The Big Sioux flooding runs its course in what you would think would be a relatively short time, 2 or 3 weeks per episode. The James River takes 6 or more weeks to route through the whole system. That's why we are on day 336 from last year's. So this flooding in the James, or the snow in the James, will just further exacerbate the very long duration of flooding along the James itself. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kevin. Right now we have no other questions for you all in the question box. We'll give you guys another minute maybe to type out a question in the question box, and then we will conclude the call. All right, seeing no other questions, we will remind you all that you can contact your local National Weather Service office if you have any additional questions following this presentation. And we wanted to thank you for today's participation in the webinar. We will be providing an update, as Jim said, and conduct another webinar on Thursday, February 27th at 2:30 p.m. Central Time. The invites to that webinar information will be emailed out soon. Thanks and have a great afternoon.
So it does look like we did have one more question come in. Kevin, are you still there? Okay, we can just have Kevin get with this individual and address the question offline.